What if everything you thought you knew about monsters was wrong? You imagined snarls, claws, violence. But what if one day a creature stepped out of the mist and it was crying? Washington State, 1993. A widow, 64, living alone deep in the forest after losing her husband. Heart shattered. Silence everywhere, until one morning, from the fog, something stepped forward, not to attack, but to grieve. And then, something extraordinary. A connection formed, no words, just gifts, glances, and tears. This isn't a story about a beast. It's about grief and the quiet bond between two broken souls, even if one of them wasn't human. Everything was recorded in her journals. Today, scientists studying interspecies empathy are still baffled. Because each morning for 37 days, it left something on her porch. A feather, a fern, a heart-shaped stone. If you've ever lost someone, don't skip this story. Because sometimes, the one who understands your pain the most isn't even human. And this only happened once, before the forest was gone forever. Washington, 1993. After the funeral, after the casseroles and the empty glances and the well-meant advice to move on, Martha Beckett packed only what she could carry. No letters, no photographs, just a pair of boots, a dented thermos, and her late husband's flannel jacket that still smelled like pine and old smoke. She didn't leave to run. She left because the silence inside the house was heavier than the one outside. The cabin in the forest hadn't been used in years. Built by her husband's own hands, it had once been their retreat, their little rebellion against the hum of the world. Now it stood quiet, swallowed by moss and memory. She unlocked the creaking door and stepped into a stillness so thick it felt like something holding its breath. At first, the forest welcomed her like a forgotten friend, the distant rustle of squirrels, the slow sway of cedar boughs in the wind. Everything moved in rhythm with her grief. She chopped wood without thinking, lit the fire, swept dust. Days bled into each other, but the fourth night, something shifted. It wasn't loud. That was the thing. It was the kind of quiet that rang in your ears, that pushed against your chest like water pressure. The usual forest noise fell away. No crickets, no owls, not even the wind whispering through the evergreens. She sat by the fire, boots off, rubbing her aching feet, when the feeling came, sharp, cold, and unmistakable. Someone, or something, was watching. Not a passerby, not a bear. Something aware. The next morning she hiked deeper into the woods, not to escape, not to chase. She didn't know why her boots kept moving forward. But every crunch of leaf underfoot felt necessary, like punctuation in a sentence she hadn't yet read. Hours passed. The light changed. Shadows stretched long and uncertain. And then, just past a split-trunk cedar, she found it. A circle of stones, carefully placed. No moss on them, recently disturbed. A message, a warning, or an invitation. She didn't speak, just stood still, trying not to breathe too loudly. The air smelled different, damp earth, old bark, and something else. A scent that didn't belong to human or beast. And then, just beyond the fog, across the narrow ridge of trees, a shape moved. Not quickly, not to flee. It moved like something that already knew it had been seen. Shiv turned back. Shiv gripped the rifle slung across her shoulder, but her arm stayed still, heavy with something she didn't have a name for. Whatever it was out there, it wasn't trying to hide. It wanted to be known, and that was the beginning. Not of fear, but of the question that would haunt her through every silent night that followed. What if the forest wasn't empty? What if it never had been? The trail Martha followed that day wasn't marked on any map. It wove deeper than she had ever gone before, curling through ferns taller than her waist and trees so wide their roots rose like ribs from the forest floor. The air was denser here, the light thinner, and though the sun still hovered somewhere above the canopy, it felt like dusk had settled early. Her boots scuffed the damp earth. Twigs snapped like brittle bones underfoot. Yet, not once did she look back. She carried only a rifle slung across her shoulder and a cloth satchel with 2 granola bars, a canteen, and a weathered leather-bound notebook, her husband's. Not because she thought she'd need it, but because letting it sit untouched felt like betrayal. She didn't write in it. Not yet. She wasn't sure what story she was part of. For hours she walked, no destination, no plan, just the impulse to move forward, to lean into the unspoken pull that had been growing since the day she'd smelled that strange scent outside her cabin. The further she went, the more the forest changed. Less bird call, more rustling. Too rhythmic to be wind. Trees leaned in close, shadows curling tight around their bases like sleeping animals. She paused to drink at a narrow stream. The water was shockingly cold. As she leaned forward, she caught it again. That scent. Faint, but there. Earthy, animal. And something else beneath it. Something familiar in the most unsettling way. Like a smell from childhood you can place but know in your bones. That was when she saw it. Just across the water, high on a ridge. Movement. A tall figure. Too tall. It moved with weight, with intention, but not with fear. Not like a man, and not like any animal she'd ever seen. It didn't run. It simply turned and disappeared behind the trees. Her pulse jumped. She didn't scream. Didn't even lift the rifle. Instead, she found herself whispering without realizing it. "I see you." And then something stranger happened. A rustle behind her. She spun, heart hammering. Nothing. But at her feet, where no one had stood seconds ago, was a small formation of stones. 5, arranged in a spiral. She froze. There was no trail of footprints, no broken branches, but the stones were warm when she touched one. Warm like a hand had just left it. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't a trap. It was a sign. Something had walked beside her, silently, willingly, and had chosen that exact moment to say, "You're not walking alone." She stood there longer than she meant to, feeling the weight of unseen eyes, of some deep, ancient presence not hostile, but aware. Only when the light began to vanish did she start her way back, slowly, listening harder than she had in years, because something out there had noticed her, and for the first time in months, maybe years, she realized she wanted to be seen. That night, the smell returned, not drifting in like wood smoke from a neighbor's fire or the musty rot of wet leaves, but sudden, present, like stepping into a room where someone had just been crying. Martha had smelled blood before, real blood, in field tents, under halogen lights, soaked into sheets she could never quite wash clean. But this scent was older, like earth grieving something deep beneath it. She opened the cabin door, and the cold hit her, sharp as breath held too long. Fog poured over the forest floor like it was being exhaled from the belly of the mountain. The air clung to her skin. Still no sound, no frogs, no wind. Just the quiet that waits for something to break. She stepped off the porch with the flashlight in hand, casting a narrow path of trembling gold through the mist. Her boots sank slightly into the mossy ground. Every step felt like walking across someone's grave. And there it was again, stronger now. That scent, damp fur, charred cedar, and beneath it, copper. But not metallic, not human. She scanned the dark. No eyes caught the light, no branches moved, but the feeling crawled across her back like cold fingers. Something had been standing exactly where she now stood, watching. She didn't run, didn't call out. Instead, she sat down on a fallen log, rifle beside her, breathing slowly. She wasn't hunting. She wasn't defending. She was waiting. For what? She didn't know. But the forest knew. And then came the sound. Not a footstep, not an animal cry, but a deep, shuddering breath. Not from her. Not close, but real. Not close, and full of something so human it nearly broke her. Sorrow. She closed her eyes. Just for a second. And saw it, not a face, but the impression of one, large, low-browed, eyes heavy with a grief too familiar. Somewhere in the fog, someone, something, was mourning. And then, a single snap of twig behind her, deliberate, like punctuation. She turned fast, light sweeping the trees, and found nothing. But on the log beside her now sat something small, out of place. A single leaf, turned upside down, weighted by a smooth black stone. She didn't speak, didn't move, just stared, because she hadn't brought it. And no one else had walked beside her. The stone was warm again. She picked it up, and a shock ran up her arm. Not electric, but old. Like memory. Like a heartbeat buried beneath bark. The forest didn't answer when she whispered, "I know you're there." But it didn't have to. She rose, cradling the stone in her palm like it might tell her everything if she just held it long enough. But it didn't speak. Nothing did. Until the wind stirred again, and the trees bent, not away from her, but toward. And for the first time, she realized the silence wasn't empty. It was listening. The fourth morning broke in silence, but not the hollow kind. It was the kind of silence that waited, that held its breath right alongside you. The fog was heavier than usual, draped over the trees like a funeral veil. Martha stood on her porch with her coffee cooling in her hand, eyes fixed on the edge of the tree line. She didn't know what she was expecting. Perhaps nothing, but her stomach was tight. Not from fear, but from something closer to knowing. She had seen strange things in her life. War, death, but never this quiet anticipation. This way the world seemed to tip forward on the verge of something ancient. And then she saw her. At first, she thought it was a bear, but the shape was all wrong. Taller, upright, immensely still. The figure stood halfway between shadow and light, 30 yards out, half shrouded in mist, but unmistakably watching. Broad shoulders, thick fur that caught the dew. And the eyes. God, those eyes. They weren't glowing or monstrous. They were brown, deep, and devastatingly sad. Martha didn't move. Her fingers tightened slightly on the mug, but she didn't raise it. Didn't raise her voice. She stood there, the two of them separated by 30 paces and 4 million years of evolution. And somehow the distance between them had never felt smaller. She should have run, should have shouted or grabbed the rifle by the door, but her body didn't listen to reason. It listened to something older, something buried deep in marrow and instinct. The creature didn't flinch, didn't blink, just stood there in that cold hush of mourning like a sentry or a widow. Then came the jolt. Clean, sudden, undeniable. The creature's hand, massive and furred, came up slowly to rest over her belly. Not threatening, protective, and the implication hit harder than any sound could have. She was pregnant. Martha's breath caught. The air around her tightened. Because this wasn't some cryptid or animal. This was someone carrying life, and perhaps, like Martha, carrying grief just as heavy. She had been so sure she was the only one mourning out here. But now, as the creature lowered her hand and turned slowly back into the woods, dissolving into the trees without a single branch breaking, Martha's legs almost gave out. She leaned hard against the railing, not out of terror, but out of something deeper. Recognition. Because now she understood what had been watching her all this time. It wasn't a monster. It was someone who had also lost too much, and somewhere inside, something shifted. She wasn't alone anymore, not truly. And neither was she. It started with the scent again, But this time, it didn't drift in like some haunted perfume. It was waiting for her, sharp, specific, right at the threshold of the cabin door. Martha stepped outside with a strange certainty curling in her gut, as if she'd woken from a dream mid-sentence, and the next word was already etched in the morning air. She didn't bring the rifle, didn't need the flashlight. Her instincts were no longer afraid. They were alert, curious. The fog had thinned slightly, enough to see the outline of her boots against the pine needles. That's when she saw it. Not the creature, but a bundle, neatly placed where the stone had been left days before. Her breath caught. It wasn't random. A braid of grass, interwoven with thistle and purple wildflowers, bound like an offering. Laid on top, a single feather, long and steel gray, larger than anything belonging to any bird she knew. Not eagle, not hawk. It had been placed deliberately, not dropped. She crouched beside it slowly, fingers trembling not from fear, but from the realization that something, not human, had gone out of its way to show care. Not aggression, not demand, a gift. She didn't touch it at first, just watched. The way the grass moved slightly in the breeze, but the feather stayed still, anchored like it belonged there. She felt her throat tighten. Someone had seen her, and someone had chosen to speak in the only way they could. But then, something even more unsettling. There were no tracks, not a single depression in the dirt, no drag marks, no bent stems. Whatever had placed this stood upright, stepped lightly, thought about being seen. Martha picked up the bundle with both hands gently, held it to her chest like it might be warm. And for the first time in months, her eyes filled, not because she was scared, but because someone out here had noticed she was grieving and answered it. A few minutes later, she left something of her own. She didn't think about it long. Instinct took over. The red ribbon she used to tie her hair. The one her husband always said made her look too young for him. She looped around a stick and wedged it into the base of a stump where the creature had once stood. No note, no name. Just tell her. She stood there a while after, the wind tugging at her sleeves. She didn't expect anything in return. But deep down she hoped the forest would answer again. And it would. Just not the way she expected. That night, the world turned silent again. Not the soft silence of peace, but the brittle kind that snaps under weight. Even the fire inside the cabin seemed to dim without cause, its glow flickering low like a candle, sensing something outside. Martha didn't sleep. Couldn't. She sat upright in the old rocker, her eyes flicking between the window and the door. There was no storm, no wind, but the stillness pressed in too tightly, like a breath being held too long. She stood and opened the door. The air outside was colder than it should have been for that hour, wrapped in fog so dense it swallowed even her own footsteps. She didn't call out. Her voice wouldn't have carried anyway. Not through this hush, this dense waiting. Then, from the edge of visibility, she saw movement. Not a full shape, just the outline of something shifting inside the mist, stepping forward until the fog slid off its shoulders like smoke peeling from bone. The figure stood there, closer than before, maybe 20 feet. The light from the lantern behind her barely reached its face, but what it didn't light, the heart seemed to understand anyway. It was her. The same towering creature she'd seen days before, broad, covered in dark fur, powerful, and yet not threatening, not even cautious. This time, Martha noticed the details, the curve of the brow, the long fingers brushing against tangled, matted hair, bits of moss, twigs and old leaves tangled into what looked almost like a crown. Not a decoration, a history. But it was the eyes that held her there. They were focused, not on the cabin, not on her hands, not even on the red ribbon tied days ago now fluttering nearby, but on her. Like recognition, like memory. She could barely breathe. Her fingers itched to reach for something. Words, gesture, anything. But she had nothing to give. The creature stepped forward once. Martha tensed, then relaxed. It wasn't coming closer to threaten. It was only adjusting, the way a person shifts their weight when deciding whether to speak or stay silent. And then it turned its head slightly, as if listening. Its breath came visible in the cold, long, steady. And then it did something Martha could never have imagined. It lowered itself, slowly, one knee into the moss, one massive hand pressing gently to the forest floor. A posture not of fear, but reverence, and that moment cracked something inside her. Not with noise, but like a frozen lake thawing in spring. Because kneeling in front of her wasn't a beast. It was someone who had known mourning, someone who understood what it meant to kneel when you have no more words left. And Martha, still barefoot on the porch, stepped forward into that silence, not to speak, but to listen. The next morning, the earth felt changed, not just colder, not just quieter, changed. As though something sacred had passed through in the night and left the air rearranged. Martha stepped outside barefoot, the wood of the porch cool beneath her feet, and stared at the place where the creature had knelt just hours ago. There was no trace. No mark in the moss, no lingering smell. But she knew in that strange way only silence can confirm, that the moment had been real. She didn't try to follow. Instead, she walked the long, sloping path down toward the stream, where the trees grew older and the ground stayed damp all year. Her fingers brushed over trunks as she passed, not for balance, but for touch, as if the bark might hold some leftover warmth. When she reached the flat stones near the water, she stopped, and there, placed gently atop the largest rock, was another gift. A small piece of folded bark, tied with grass, cradling something round. She bent down slowly and lifted it. Inside was a stone, not large, not heavy, but perfectly smooth, worn by time, river polished. At first, she thought it was just a rock, but as the sun caught its surface, she saw it, etched into one side with something like a claw or nail, a circle with a single line bisecting it top to bottom. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't art. It was communication. She clutched the stone tight to her chest and stood there, water trickling nearby, the trees closing in around her. And then she knew what she had to do. Back at the cabin, she retrieved something from the shelf behind the stove. It was small, flat, and smooth, worn from decades of handling. Her husband's lucky stone, the one he kept in his pocket every time they hiked or camped, the one he rubbed when anxious, the one he had clutched in the hospital bed, unconscious, as if still reaching for the woods. She wrapped it in cloth, not because it was delicate, but because it mattered. Then she left it at the base of the same tree where the creature had once stood. She didn't hide it, didn't bury it, just placed it there, exposed to the light. She didn't know what would happen next, but she didn't feel empty. Not anymore. And as the wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and something faintly wild, she turned back toward the cabin and whispered aloud for the first time in weeks, voice raspy but certain. "I saw you." And from deep within the trees, no sound came back, but the silence smiled. That night, sleep didn't come. Not because of fear, but because of weight. A quiet, steady pulse beneath the surface of things. Martha sat at her kitchen table, the only light a dull orange from the stove's last breath of fire. Her fingers turned the stone slowly in her palm, the one the creature had left, and beside it sat her husband's, both of them warm, though the air had gone bone cold. She hadn't written in days, but now she opened his notebook, not to explain, just to mark it. 1 page, 2 words. She came. Just after midnight, the silence broke. Not a crash, not a scream, but the subtle shift of everything holding its breath again. She stepped onto the porch and felt the cold bite hard. Frost clung to the trees. The air smelled metallic and deep, like wet bark and blood from long ago. The woods weren't moving. They were bracing. And then, there she was. The creature stood at the clearing's edge, breath heavy and white against the black. This time, closer. This time, changed. The shoulders had slumped. The chest rose with shallow rhythm. Her arms cradled her belly, not with pride but with strain. Martha didn't need a word to understand. Pain. Not just labor pain, not yet, but fear. Exhaustion. Something was wrong. Martha stepped forward instinctively, hands raised just enough to say, "I'm here." The creature didn't move away. Her massive eyes locked on Martha's like a plea, quiet and ancient. And for a moment, everything inside Martha's old bones remembered the weight of another's life, warm and small. Inside a body trembling with hope and dread, she whispered, not for the creature, but for herself, "You're not alone." And then something changed in the air. Behind the creature, just at the fringe of the trees, came a low vibration. Not sound exactly, more like pressure, a presence. Watching. Heavy. Cold. Not like her. Martha didn't see it, but she felt it. The creature took a step closer, almost staggered, then dropped to one knee. Breath ragged now. Her hand hit the ground. Fingers curled into the dirt. Martha rushed forward before thinking. No weapon, no coat. Just human instinct and whatever pieces of faith she had left. She didn't touch her. Just knelt close, letting their breath fog in rhythm. And in that moment, something passed between them. Not words, not touch, but knowing. Sorrow meeting sorrow. Life asking life to stay. And somewhere, deep in the trees behind them, the watcher kept still, not intervening, not welcoming, waiting. But for now, Martha only saw her. And the quiet truth took root. The forest had given her something not even her grief-stricken heart had dared ask for. Someone to save. Morning broke not with birdsong, but with the brittle sound of ice cracking across the roof. Martha opened her eyes to a pale light washing over the cabin walls, and a tightness in her chest she hadn't felt since the hospital years ago. An urgency without panic. She moved quickly, gathering blankets, water, the fire starter, and a small metal tin filled with dried herbs her grandmother once used for childbirth. Her hands didn't shake. Her breath didn't stutter. Somewhere inside, the part of her that had stood beside the dying had risen again. Calm, clear, ready. By the time she reached the grove, the frost had turned the ground to glass. The creature was there, slumped forward, body heaving in short bursts. Her arms cradled her belly. And a strange sound, not quite a moan and not quite a growl, trembled through the trees. Martha knelt down slowly, not touching, just breathing with her. The air was thick with pain, but it wasn't chaos. It was the sacred kind, the kind that happens between one breath and the next, when life begins clawing its way into the world. Minutes blurred. Time became only the rhythm of the creature's breathing, and the way her eyes never left Martha's. She handed over the herbs without ceremony, whispered instructions she didn't know would be understood, and stayed beside her, one hand placed gently on the creature's back. Firm and steady. Then came the moment. Sudden, raw, complete. A final push, a low thunder through the lungs. And then silence so deep it felt like the world itself paused to bear witness. A cry broke through. High. Fragile. Alive. The creature collapsed backward, chest rising and falling with exhaustion. And between her arms, something moved. Tiny, furred. Its cry not animal, not human, just new. Martha didn't cry. She only reached forward, her hands cradling the warmth of the moment, not to hold the child, but to steady the mother. There was blood. There was life. There was life. But just when peace threatened to settle, a rustle came from beyond the trees. Martha turned. A silhouette, taller, broader, stood just at the edge of the clearing, watching, not approaching. And though it didn't move, she felt it speak without words. The child was not just born into the world. It was born into a world being watched. She said nothing, just gathered her things, tucked the blanket around the mother, and stepped back. This was no longer hers to hold. But as she turned toward the cabin, one soft sound reached her. Not the child, not the wind, a whisper, deep and low, like thank you or goodbye. Or both. She didn't return to the grove for 2 days, not out of fear, but because something in her understood the silence that must follow birth. It wasn't her place to intrude. Instead, Martha stayed close to the cabin, gathering dried berries from the bushes near the creek, stacking wood, preparing simple foods she didn't have much appetite for. The air had changed, not darker, not lighter, just listening. Each step outside felt like walking through a sacred hall. One wrong noise might fracture something too delicate to be spoken aloud. On the third morning, a bird sang again, just one, from deep in the cedars. A sound so clean and clear it nearly brought her to her knees. She packed a basket, warm cloth, the last of her preserved roots, a bit of honey wrapped in wax paper, and walked the path, slow and deliberate, like stepping into memory. The snow had melted in the glade, not from weather, from warmth, and they were there, mother and child, nestled beneath a lean-to of branches that hadn't been there before. Someone had built it, not her. The child was sleeping, tucked close, its fur lighter, softer, ears small and tight to its head. The mother looked up as Martha approached, not startled, not tired, just still. Their eyes met. No movement, no sound. Then, slowly, the mother reached to her side and picked up something Martha hadn't noticed before. It was a ring, made of twine and bark and small feathers, woven so tightly it looked impossibly intricate. She held it in both hands, then placed it on the ground between them. It wasn't a gift. It wasn't repayment. It was recognition. Martha knelt, her knees sinking into damp moss, and reached into her basket. She placed the cloth-wrapped honey beside the ring. Then, with care, she removed her wedding band, the one she hadn't worn since he passed, but had kept on a string around her neck. She laid it next to the ring of feathers, not as offering, as answer. They sat that way for a long time, two women who had never spoken, bound by things no words could carry. When Martha rose, the mother didn't follow. She only nodded once, and as Martha turned back toward the trees, the child stirred softly, a small sound like breath catching on the edge of newness. She didn't look back, but she felt it, the weight of something that had begun, and something else that had quietly, reverently, ended. Winter moved in quietly that year. Not sudden, not harsh, just sure of itself. The air grew tighter around the mornings. The ground hardened under each step, and frost etched lace onto the cabin windows, like someone remembering old stories. Martha felt the change not just in the weather, but in her bones. Not age, not sorrow, something else. She didn't dream as often anymore. When she did, it was quiet, filled with colorless forests and long shadows. But she woke with peace. She hadn't seen the creature since the ring had been exchanged. No gifts, no movement, only stillness. And still, each morning when she stepped outside, something had shifted. The red ribbon she'd tied months ago now hung from a branch higher than she could reach. The path near the stream remained swept clean of pine cones, though no wind had passed through. Sometimes, when she wasn't looking for anything at all, she'd feel it, a warmth just beyond vision, like standing in sunlight right before it touches the skin. It had never been about proof. That part left her long ago. She didn't need to know what it was. Only that it was. And that it had known her. One day, while cleaning the hearth, she found a bundle tucked behind the firewood. Soft, dry, bound with woven reed. Inside, 3 things. A smooth black stone, not her own. A small carved stick marked with tiny lines like tally marks or time. And a single gray tuft of down. She didn't cry. She smiled, because she understood. The stone was memory. The stick was counting. Perhaps years, perhaps children, perhaps all of it. And the feather, a thank you, or a goodbye. She packed the bundle gently into her cedar chest, alongside her husband's flannel, and the broken watch had never gotten fixed. And that night, before sleep claimed her, she lit a single candle and whispered into the dark, "I remember." It snowed the next morning, thick, silent, pure, and when she opened the door, the first thing she saw was the ring of footprints, not human, not boots, circling the cabin in one perfect round, not approaching, not retreating, just there. A quiet declaration, you were not forgotten. And though she said nothing to the empty trees, her breath caught at the edge of a laugh. Not because it was over, but because something had stayed. Something she'd never dared expect, presence without demand. And far off, where the trees grew thickest, a child's cry echoed once, soft, low, then gone. Martha never told anyone, not when her niece came up in spring with fresh linens and books she'd never read, not when the ranger drove by and offered to replace the cracked shingles on the roof, not when the pastor from town left a note in her mailbox that simply said, "Still praying for you." She nodded, smiled, poured tea, but her hand stayed quiet, because the words didn't belong to anyone else. Not in English, not in scripture, not even in memory. Some things are meant to be held, not spoken. She kept the bundle in the cedar chest. Sometimes she opened it just to breathe in the scent of wood and old leaf. Sometimes she just ran her fingers over the feather, so fine it felt like smoke. And some nights, when the wind moaned low through the trees and the cabin walls creaked like an old man shifting in bed, she would reach for her husband's notebook, not to write, but to hold, as if through his old scribbles and half-finished thoughts, he might still be listening. One page had been folded twice, worn soft at the edges. She unfolded it again, the same way she had a dozen times before. Just 3 lines. She stood. She watched. She did not leave first. It wasn't dated. It wasn't signed. But it was in her handwriting, and that's how she kept it, how she honored what had come and gone and lingered. Not in proof, not in story, but in presence. Years later, after her passing, it was her niece who found the chest. The cabin had grown quiet without Martha's firewood, without her boots stomping snow off the porch, without the sound of her kettle whistling into the dusk. The niece packed gently, carefully, as though the walls might sigh at being touched. And beneath the flannel shirts and old notebooks, she found it. The ring, the stone, the feather, and that folded page. She didn't understand it. Not fully, but when she walked to the edge of the woods, bundle in hand, something inside her chest ached, not painfully, but deeply, as if some old cord had been plucked. And in that silence, a wind passed through, not cold, not warm, but steady. She stayed a moment longer than she meant to, because sometimes, even when we don't believe in monsters, we still believe in what they leave behind. The attic floor groaned under the weight of dust and time. Her niece, Claire, hadn't meant to explore up there. Only followed a draft that tugged oddly at the hallway curtain. The trapdoor had been slightly ajar, like someone had opened it and never quite closed it again. A whisper of cold climbed down from the dark. She climbed up, careful, one boot after another, flashlight gripped in her fist like a lifeline. It was mostly what you'd expect. Old boxes, paperbacks swollen from damp, mason jars without lids. But there was a trunk. Not the cedar chest, a different one. Metal latched, covered in an old army blanket. Something about it felt untouched. She hesitated. Inside, there were only a few things. A folded shawl, a rusted compass, and a book. A plain, cloth-bound journal wrapped in twine. When she undid the knot and opened to the last page, it was written in the same hand as the notes they'd found in the cabin, Martha's. But this entry was different. It read, "She wasn't a monster. She wasn't a ghost. She mourned, she bled, she brought life. And when she looked at me, I remembered how to be human." Claire didn't move for a long time. The attic felt warmer somehow, the air less stale. She turned the page. Tucked in the spine was something small, a drawing, childlike, done in charcoal. A tall figure, holding hands with a much smaller one, beneath a tree with no leaves, no names. No names, no date. Downstairs the kettle had started to hiss. Claire descended, slower now, journal tucked under her arm like a secret. Outside the wind had shifted, not loud, not fierce, just different. She went to the porch and stood where Martha once stood. And across the clearing, in the hush of evergreens, something moved. It didn't step out. It didn't wave. It only stayed just long enough for her to feel the weight of it. And then it was gone, but not forgotten. And that night, when Claire fell asleep in the same creaky bed her aunt had once filled with breath and silence and waiting, she dreamed of footsteps in snow that didn't melt, and of a circle drawn in ash that never quite washed away. Some people spend their whole lives waiting for proof. For the photo, the footprint, the soundbite that says, "See, I told you." But others, like Martha, never needed the world to believe, because some truths are heavier than belief. Some are only real when you stop asking them to prove themselves. Claire didn't speak about the attic, not to the ranger, not to her siblings, not even in the eulogy she gave standing under low gray skies, while the wind swept across Martha's grave like it had been waiting. But she kept the journal. Read it in pieces, never all at once, as if reading too fast might break whatever thread still connected them. A year passed, then 2. The cabin stayed closed for most of it, but Claire returned each fall, just as her aunt had. She brought nothing but quiet and time. She didn't leave offerings. She didn't hope for sightings. Still, every visit, something changed, just enough to notice. A branch arranged in a perfect arch over the path. A feather stuck upright in a patch of moss. One year, a small stack of flat stones near the door, arranged in a shape that felt like a word too old to translate. She once whispered into the woods, "Was it real?" And the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of breath. On her 5th visit, she found the ribbon. Not hers, Martha's, faded red, still tied in that same knot, hung now from the tallest tree by the stream, so high no human could have reached it without rope or ladder. She laughed. Not loud. Just enough to feel it in her ribs, because suddenly she didn't need the answer anymore. It wasn't about Bigfoot. It was about grief that had nowhere to go, finding a place to land. It was about someone, something, seeing the part of you that still bled and choosing not to run. And maybe, just maybe, it was about something older than myth, something that still walks the woods not because it hides, but because it watches. And if you're quiet enough, still enough, and wounded just right, it might watch you back. She stepped into the cabin one last time that season, closed the door softly behind her, and lit the lamp with hands that no longer shook. And across the clearing, just for a second, the trees bent the wrong way, toward her. They say we fear what we don't understand. But what if what we fear understands us better than we understand ourselves? Claire stood at the edge of the clearing, the last orange threads of dusk tugging through the branches like fingertips brushing old cloth. She wasn't there to look for anything, not anymore. She'd stopped trying to see. She only came to feel. That evening, she brought nothing. No offerings. No books. Just her breath, slow and quiet, and the worn page of Martha's journal folded in her jacket pocket. She sat where the old bench used to be, though it had long since rotted into earth. Moss took its place. It always does. The trees didn't move. No birds called. But she knew. She could feel it again. That familiar gravity, like the woods themselves were leaning in, holding a breath too big for lungs. And then came the question, not in words, not in sound, just there. Like a weight in her chest, if they can mourn, if they can love, if they can choose, what makes us so sure we're the only ones who deserve to be remembered? She thought of Martha, of the baby that cried once and never again, of the circle drawn not to trap, but to honor. She thought of how grief didn't end. It only found new forms. And sometimes those forms had fur, or silence, or eyes that glistened in the dark. Not with rage, but with recognition. The wind stirred, just once. Enough to lift a leaf and send it spinning in front of her boots before it fell. And with it, a shape, not approaching, not stalking, just there, large, still, watching. Claire didn't move. She didn't need to, because she knew this wasn't the beginning of another legend. It was the echo of one. And as the shape faded back into the woods, swallowed not by fear but by choice, she whispered what Martha once had, without even knowing. I see you. Then, turning back toward the cabin, toward light, toward memory, she stepped gently, not to disturb, not to leave a mark, but to say, some stories don't need telling to be true. Some truths breathe better in the dark. Out there, in the hush between the trees, there are things we may never understand, not because they are beyond reason, but because they speak in a language older than words, a language of stillness, of gesture, of presence, a kind of knowing that doesn't need to explain itself. And maybe, just maybe, the most extraordinary truths are the ones that don't try to prove anything at all. Because this wasn't a story about monsters, or myths, or whether something out there exists. It was about what happens when the noise fades and we allow ourselves to truly listen. When grief has hollowed us out so completely that silence becomes its own kind of prayer. It's in those moments, quiet, raw, unshaped, where something else can enter. Not to fix us, not to explain why the world sometimes breaks without reason, but to stand beside us in the ache. We live in a world obsessed with answers, with proof, with hard lines and sharper edges. But the most sacred things, love, loss, empathy, connection, they don't follow rules. They grow wild like forest moss, in places no one thought to look. And sometimes, healing doesn't arrive as a miracle. It arrives as a quiet figure at the tree line, waiting. It arrives when we stop reaching outward and begin allowing ourselves to be found. What if the measure of our humanity wasn't how loudly we speak, but how gently we witness? What if the most intelligent life form isn't the one with the biggest brain or the strongest voice, but the one that kneels, that watches, that grieves with you? There are stories meant to be told. And then there are stories meant to be kept, held not in books or broadcasts, but in the breath between seasons, in the hush of dusk, in the knowing glance between one soul and another, no matter how different their skin, their silence, their shape. This story asked nothing of you. It only hoped you'd stay long enough to feel something shift. So if you're still here, still listening, thank you. We invite you to share what stirred inside you. Was it a memory? A belief? A question you didn't know you were carrying? Leave a comment. Let us know. Stories, after all, are kept alive by those who continue them. And if you believe there's still magic in this world, still mystery worth holding gently, Subscribe, follow, and stay with us, because somewhere in the dark, something is still listening. And sometimes, what listens back is love.